He thought he could break her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he had just stepped into his own humiliation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the dojo, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor as the steady rhythm of training filled the air, controlled movements, sharp breaths, quiet confidence, the kind built over years of discipline, and right in the middle of it stood Brad Hoffman, arms crossed, watching like a man who believed he owned every inch of that room. The door creaked open, soft but noticeable, and a few heads turned as Amanda Carter stepped inside, her presence almost too simple to belong there. A gray hoodie slightly oversized, black leggings, and a neatly tied yellow belt that immediately drew a few amused glances from the more experienced students. At 38, Amanda carried herself without urgency, her steps measured, her posture relaxed, like someone who had nothing to prove and no need to rush. But in a room like this, calmness was often mistaken for weakness. Brad's eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering just long enough to form his judgment before he even spoke, and when he did, his voice carried across the floor with the kind of casual authority that expected silence in return. "You sure you're in the right place?" he said, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, as a few black belts nearby exchanged knowing looks. The room didn't stop, but it shifted, attention tightening subtly, like a lens focusing on something that might become entertaining. Amanda paused near the edge of the mat, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her expression neutral, almost unreadable, and for a brief moment, it felt like the air itself hesitated. "I'm here to train," she replied, her voice soft, steady, without a trace of defensiveness, and that only made the smirk on Brad's face deepen. He let out a short laugh, not loud, but sharp enough to ripple through the nearby students. "Train," he repeated, as if testing the word for irony, then gestured casually toward the advanced group. "This isn't a beginner's fitness class. People here take this seriously." A few quiet chuckles followed, nothing explosive, just enough to draw a line between her and them. Amanda didn't react, didn't shift, didn't argue, and that stillness made something flicker, almost imperceptibly, in the eyes of one or two students who were paying closer attention. Brad stepped forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to make his presence feel heavier. "Tell you what," he continued, his tone light but edged with challenge, "why don't you watch for today, get a feel for how things work before you jump in?" It sounded reasonable on the surface, but the undertone was clear, a quiet dismissal dressed as guidance. The room seemed to agree with him, bodies turning back to training, conversations resuming, but not fully, not completely, because something about Amanda didn't quite fit the script they were used to. She gave a small nod, as if accepting the suggestion, but her eyes moved slowly across the room, observing, measuring, noticing details most people ignored, the spacing, the timing, the rhythm of movement, and for just a fraction of a second, there was a depth there that didn't match the yellow belt tied around her waist. Brad turned away, already bored, already convinced he had understood her completely, and that was the moment everything quietly began to unravel, though no one in that room realized it yet. The floor creaked softly under shifting weight. The sounds of practice filled the space again, but beneath it all, something had changed, subtle, almost invisible, like the calm surface of water just before it reveals how deep it really is. And somewhere in that stillness, Amanda Carter stood without moving, without speaking, as if she were waiting, not for permission, but for the exact moment the room would finally understand who had just walked in. Brad did not notice it at first, but a few of the more experienced students had begun watching Amanda instead of their partners, not because she moved, but because she did not. And in a place where everything was about motion, stillness stood out more than any strike ever could. The class continued, drills repeating in precise rhythm, feet sliding across the mat, controlled breathing echoing softly, yet Amanda's eyes followed each sequence with quiet precision, as if she were not just observing, but remembering something long buried. One of the younger black belts, a confident man named Eric Lawson, noticed her gaze and smirked, nudging the student beside him. "She looks like she is studying for a test she is not ready for," he muttered, just loud enough for a few others to hear, drawing a ripple of low laughter. Amanda heard it. Of course she did. But her expression did not change, and that lack of reaction only fed the subtle tension building in the room. Brad, sensing the shift in attention, clapped his hands once, sharp and commanding. "Pair up," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let us see some real control." The students moved quickly, forming pairs, but not without a few glances drifting back toward Amanda, curiosity now mixing with the earlier amusement. Eric stepped forward with an easy confidence, rolling his shoulders as if warming up for something entertaining rather than instructional. "Hey," he called out casually, turning toward Brad but clearly directing his words for everyone to hear. "Maybe she wants to try. Might be fun." A few chuckles followed again, slightly louder this time, the atmosphere shifting from dismissal to anticipation. Brad paused, considering it for a moment, then glanced over at Amanda with a look that carried both challenge and certainty. "You said you came to train," he said, his tone light but edged. "This is training." The room seemed to hold its breath just a little longer than usual, as if waiting for her to refuse, to step back, to confirm what everyone had already decided about her. Amanda took a single step forward onto the mat, her movement calm, unhurried, and something about that simple step made the air feel heavier, though no one could explain why. She adjusted the edge of her sleeve, not nervously, but deliberately, as if aligning herself with something internal rather than external, and when she finally looked up, her gaze met Eric's for the first time. There was no challenge in her eyes, no anger, just a steady clarity that did not match the role they had assigned to her. Eric gave a quick, amused exhale, bouncing lightly on his feet, as if to exaggerate the difference between them. "Do not worry," he said, grinning. "We will keep it simple." The surrounding students leaned in slightly, forming an unspoken circle, their movements slowing, their attention narrowing, and even Brad found himself watching more closely than he had intended. Amanda nodded once, a small, almost polite gesture, and then she stood still again, not raising her guard, not shifting her stance, simply present. That was when the room began to feel it. Something subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when the air changes in a way no one can quite name. Brad's smirk lingered, but it faltered for just a fraction of a second, too brief for most to notice, as if some instinct buried deep beneath his confidence had quietly started asking a question he was not ready to answer. And across the mat, Amanda Carter waited, not tense, not hesitant, but completely certain, as though she had already seen how this moment would unfold long before anyone else realized they were part of it. No one in the room realized that the moment had already shifted, that the outcome they expected had quietly slipped out of their control the second Amanda stepped onto the mat without hesitation. Eric moved first, not aggressively, but with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times, his feet gliding across the floor, testing distance, measuring reaction, expecting uncertainty, expecting hesitation, expecting something he could easily read. But Amanda did not give him anything. She stood exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes following him with a calm that did not match the situation, and that was when the first ripple of discomfort appeared, subtle but real. Eric slowed slightly, just for a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating, then circled again, this time with a bit more intent, his movements sharper, more deliberate, trying to draw a response, any response. The students around them leaned in further, their earlier amusement fading into something quieter, more focused, as the usual rhythm of the class dissolved into a suspended moment. Brad watched closely now, his arms still crossed, but his expression tightening, his attention no longer casual, because something about Amanda's stillness was beginning to feel unfamiliar. "Any time now," Eric said lightly, though there was a slight edge beneath the words, a need to regain control of the narrative that was slipping away from him. Amanda did not reply. She simply shifted her weight by the smallest degree, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way Eric reacted to it, his stance adjusting instinctively, as if his body recognized something his mind had not yet processed. The air in the dojo grew heavier, the sounds of movement from other pairs fading completely as every eye fixed on the center of the mat. Then it happened, not with force, not with spectacle, but with precision so clean it almost looked effortless. Amanda moved once, a controlled, minimal motion that redirected Eric's momentum rather than meeting it, And in that single instant, the balance of the moment flipped. Eric found himself off-center, not thrown, not struck, but guided into a position he had not chosen, his confidence breaking not from impact but from realization. The room went completely silent. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear as understanding began to settle in, slow and undeniable. Eric stepped back, his expression no longer amused, his eyes searching Amanda's face as if trying to reconcile what he had just experienced with what he believed he knew. Amanda returned to stillness just as quickly as she had moved, her posture relaxed again, her hands at her sides, as though nothing significant had happened. Brad's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his certainty, and for a brief moment, he said nothing, which in that room was louder than any command he could have given. A quiet shift passed through the students, not dramatic, but unmistakable, as respect began to replace judgment, not because of what Amanda had said, but because of what she had not needed to say at all. And standing there in the center of the mat, Amanda Carter did not look stronger or faster or more imposing than anyone else in the room. But for the first time since she walked in, no one saw her as someone who did not belong, and that realization hung in the air like a truth no one could take back. Brad had built his reputation on control, on reading people within seconds, on knowing exactly where everyone stood the moment they stepped onto his mat. But as he watched Amanda return to that same quiet stillness, something unfamiliar settled in his chest, a hesitation he had not felt in years. The room remained suspended, no one eager to speak first, as if any sound might break something fragile that had just been revealed. Eric exhaled slowly, stepping back another inch, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty, the kind that does not come from losing, but from not understanding how the ground shifted beneath you. Brad uncrossed his arms for the first time, the subtle movement catching the attention of a few students who knew him well enough to recognize that as a sign, not of anger, but of recalculation. He took a step forward onto the mat, his presence instantly reclaiming the center of the room, yet the authority he carried now felt slightly different, not diminished, but challenged in a way that demanded clarity. Again, he said, his voice controlled, but firmer than before, directed at Eric, though his eyes never left Amanda. The word hung in the air, less like an instruction and more like a test that needed to be answered. Eric hesitated, just briefly, then nodded, resetting his stance, but the ease he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by focus sharpened through doubt. Around them, the students adjusted their positions, forming a wider circle now, not out of curiosity, but respect for the moment unfolding, their earlier assumptions dissolving into quiet attention. Amanda did not resist, did not question. She simply remained where she was, her breathing unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if the outcome of the next exchange mattered less to her than the principle behind it. Brad watched her carefully, searching for any sign of strain, any trace of effort that could explain what he had just seen, but there was nothing, only that same composed presence that refused to reveal itself. Eric moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, his steps measured with caution, his eyes locked onto Amanda's shoulders, her hips, her balance, trying to find the opening he had assumed would be obvious just minutes ago. The room seemed to lean inward, every movement magnified by the silence, every shift carrying weight. Then, once more, Amanda responded, not with force, not with speed that overwhelmed, but with timing so precise it seemed to arrive before the action itself, guiding, redirecting, dissolving tension rather than meeting it. Eric stopped, this time fully, his breath steady but his expression changed, the realization settling deeper, not just that she could match him, but that she was operating on a level he had not anticipated. A quiet murmur almost formed among the students, but died before it could become sound, replaced instead by a shared understanding that spread without words. Brad's gaze hardened, not in hostility, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern finally breaks and something real stands in its place. He stepped closer, now only a few feet away from Amanda, his voice lower when he spoke again. "Where did you train?" It was no longer a question meant to challenge, but one that sought truth. Amanda met his eyes, calm as ever, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not pride, not defiance, but something quieter, almost reflective. A long time ago, she said. The answer did not satisfy the room, but it was enough to change it. Because in that moment, everyone understood that whatever Amanda Carter carried with her into that dojo was not something learned recently, not something casual, but something earned, something lived, and the silence that followed was no longer filled with judgment, but with the weight of realization that they had all been wrong from the very beginning. The room no longer felt like a place of instruction. It felt like a place of revelation, and Brad Hoffman understood that better than anyone standing there, even if he was the last to admit it. He had spent years building authority not just through skill, but through certainty, the kind that left no room for doubt. Yet now that certainty was being quietly dismantled by a woman who had not raised her voice, had not demanded respect, and had not explained herself. He studied Amanda more carefully now, not as a beginner, not as an outsider, but as something else entirely, something he could not easily categorize, and that unsettled him more than any challenge ever had. Around them, the students had shifted completely, their stances relaxed but their attention sharp, no longer spectators waiting for entertainment, but witnesses to something they knew they would remember. Eric stepped back fully this time, giving space without being told, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to humility, and when he glanced at Brad, it was not for approval, but for understanding. Brad took another step forward, slower now, deliberate, as if every movement required more thought than it had just minutes ago. "You said a long time ago," he repeated, his voice quieter, less performative, as though the room no longer belonged to him alone. That kind of control does not come from casual training. The statement lingered, not a question, but an acknowledgement that demanded truth. Amanda's gaze did not waver, but there was a shift beneath the surface, something reflective, something that carried weight beyond the room. For a brief moment, her eyes moved past Brad, past the students, as if seeing something else entirely, something not present but still real. "It was not casual," she said finally, her tone even, but carrying a depth that changed the air once more. The silence that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy with respect that had formed without permission. One of the younger students, a woman standing near the back, lowered her arms slowly, her expression no longer guarded but thoughtful, as if re-examining everything she had assumed just moments before. Brad exhaled, a subtle release of tension that few would notice, but in that space, it mattered. He had expected resistance, maybe even confrontation, but what stood in front of him was something far more difficult to challenge: quiet mastery without ego. "Show me," he said, not as a command, but as a request, though the words still carried the weight of the room. It was the first time his voice had shifted that way, and everyone felt it. Amanda tilted her head slightly, considering, not the request itself, but the intention behind it, and for a moment, it seemed like she might refuse, not out of defiance, but because she did not need to prove anything. Then she stepped forward, just one step, placing herself at the center again, but this time the room adjusted to her, not the other way around. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The dojo, once filled with noise and hierarchy, had become something quieter, more honest. Amanda raised her hands slowly, not in defense, but in demonstration, her movements controlled, deliberate, revealing not strength through force, but through balance, timing, and awareness. It was not about overpowering, it was about understanding, and as she moved, even in the smallest ways, the students began to see what Brad had missed at first, that what she carried was not just skill, but experience shaped by something deeper than competition. Brad watched without interruption, his expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that few had ever seen, and in that moment, the roles in the room had shifted completely, not through challenge, not through dominance, but through quiet truth. And standing there, surrounded by students who had once dismissed her, Amanda Carter did not look like someone seeking validation. She looked like someone who had already found it long before she ever walked through that door. What they were witnessing was no longer a demonstration of technique. It was a quiet dismantling of everything they thought they understood about strength, and the realization settled slowly, like a truth that could not be rushed. Amanda's movements remained minimal, almost understated, yet every shift of her weight, every adjustment of her posture carried intention, not to impress, but to reveal. She was not performing for them. She was showing them something they had never been taught to see. Brad stood still, watching more intently than he had ever watched any student before, his mind working through years of experience, searching for a label, a category, something that would make sense of what stood in front of him, but nothing fit. Around the mat, the students mirrored his silence, their earlier confidence replaced by careful observation, their eyes tracking every detail as if afraid to miss something that might explain it. Amanda stepped slightly to the side, her motion smooth and unhurried, then paused again, letting the space settle, letting the room catch up to her pace rather than forcing it. It was a kind of control that did not rely on authority, but on presence, and it reshaped the atmosphere without effort. "You are not reacting," Brad said finally, his voice low, almost to himself, though everyone heard it. "You are anticipating." The distinction lingered, and for the first time, there was no challenge in his tone, only recognition. Amanda glanced at him briefly, then back to the open space in front of her. "Reacting is late," she replied, her words simple, but carrying the weight of experience. The sentence settled into the room, deeper than any command Brad had given that day. A few students shifted their stance unconsciously, as if testing that idea within their own bodies, and suddenly the class was no longer about proving skill, but about understanding something more fundamental. Eric remained where he was, watching closely now, not with ego, but with focus, replaying the moment in his mind, trying to see what he had missed. Amanda continued, her voice calm, not lecturing, not asserting, simply stating what was true. "Most people wait for movement. By then, the moment is already gone." She raised her hand slightly, not in defense, but in illustration, showing how intention could be seen before action, how balance revealed direction, how stillness itself could speak. The students leaned in again, but this time not out of curiosity, but out of respect for what they were being given. Brad's posture shifted subtly, the last traces of his earlier certainty dissolving into something more grounded, more honest. He had built his dojo on discipline, on structure, on visible progress, but what Amanda was showing could not be measured that way, and that realization changed him in a way no challenge ever had. "Where did you learn that?" one of the students asked quietly from the edge of the mat, unable to hold the question back any longer. Amanda paused, just for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different, something quieter, almost distant. "Some places do not teach you twice," she said. The words were simple, but they left a silence behind them that felt heavier than anything that had come before. No one pressed further. No one needed to. Because in that moment, they understood that what she carried was not just knowledge, but something earned through time, through experience, through moments that did not need to be explained to be felt. And standing there in the center of the dojo, Amanda Carter did not claim authority, did not demand recognition, but she changed the room completely, not by force, not by words, but by revealing a truth that once seen could never be unseen. The dojo no longer sounded the same, even though no one had spoken, because something invisible had shifted, something deeper than technique, deeper than rank, and every person in that room could feel it settling into place whether they understood it or not. Amanda lowered her hand slowly, returning once again to that quiet, grounded stillness, as if what she had just shown required no follow-up, no explanation, no validation. For her, it was complete the moment it was done. But for everyone else, it was only beginning. Brad stood there, closer than before, yet further from certainty than he had ever been, his eyes studying her not with authority, but with something far more rare, humility. It was unfamiliar to him, uncomfortable even, but undeniable. He had spent years teaching others how to read movement, how to control space, how to respond with precision, yet what Amanda had revealed did not come from instruction alone. It came from something lived, something internal, something that could not be handed down in a class. "You have been holding back," Brad said quietly, the statement more realization than accusation. Amanda did not deny it. She simply looked at him, her expression steady, not proud, not defensive, just honest. "This is not a place for proving," she replied, her voice calm, but firm in a way that carried weight without force. The words settled into the room, shifting the focus once more from performance to purpose. A few students glanced at one another, their earlier excitement now replaced with reflection, as if they were beginning to question why they had come here in the first place. Eric stepped forward again, but this time there was no arrogance in his posture, no need to impress, only curiosity, sharpened by respect. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question simple, but genuine. Amanda paused, just long enough for the room to lean into the silence, and when she answered, it was not immediate, not rehearsed, but thoughtful, as if she had not expected to say it out loud. "To see if it still feels the same," she said. The answer lingered, quiet but powerful, and something in it shifted the energy again, not outward, but inward, drawing everyone into a deeper understanding of what this moment truly was. Brad's gaze softened slightly, not losing its intensity, but losing its edge, and for the first time since she walked in, he did not see her as a disruption, but as a reminder of something he had once known but had slowly replaced with structure and routine. The younger student at the back lowered her eyes briefly, absorbing the words, while another adjusted his stance unconsciously, as if trying to reconnect with something more authentic than repetition. Amanda turned slightly, her attention no longer fixed on any one person, but on the room as a whole, and for a brief moment, it felt as though she could see through all of them, past the belts, past the hierarchy, into something simpler, something they had all started with but had gradually forgotten. "Most people come here to get stronger," she continued, her tone still even, still calm. "But strength is not what keeps you steady." The sentence landed differently than anything before it, not as instruction, but as truth, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of realization, full of reflection, full of something that did not need to be explained. Brad exhaled slowly, the tension leaving him in a way no one had ever seen, and in that moment, the man who had once controlled the room understood that control was never the point. And standing there in front of him, Amanda Carter did not claim the space, did not take authority, but she changed it completely, simply by reminding them of something they had all overlooked, something that had been there the entire time, waiting to be seen. No one moved to break the silence, because something deeper than instruction was unfolding, something that made even the smallest action feel unnecessary, as if the room itself understood that speaking too soon would diminish what had just been revealed. Amanda stood exactly where she was, not claiming attention, not seeking acknowledgement, yet every eye remained on her, not out of obligation, but because they could not look away. Brad lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection, the kind that forces a person to confront not what they have taught, but what they may have missed. For years, he had measured progress in visible ways, sharper technique, faster response, stronger presence. But what Amanda had shown could not be measured, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight he could not ignore. He looked back up, his voice different now, stripped of performance, stripped of control. "Most people spend years trying to reach what you just showed in minutes," he said, not as praise, but as recognition. Amanda's expression did not change, but there was a subtle softness now, not toward him, but toward the moment itself. "It is not something you reach," she replied gently. "It is something you stop getting in the way of." The words landed deeper than anything before, and for a moment, no one knew how to respond, because there was nothing to challenge, nothing to correct, only something to understand. Eric shifted his stance slightly, not preparing to engage, but adjusting as if testing that idea within himself, his earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet curiosity that felt more honest than anything he had shown before. The younger student near the back took a small step forward without realizing it, drawn in not by spectacle, but by clarity, as if she had just seen something she had been searching for without knowing it. Amanda turned her head slightly, her attention moving across the room, not focusing on individuals, but sensing the change as a whole, and for a brief moment, it felt as though she was no longer a participant in the class, but something else entirely, a mirror reflecting back what each person needed to see. Brad exhaled again, slower this time, and something in his posture released, something rigid becoming fluid, as if he were letting go of a version of himself that no longer fit. "I have been teaching the wrong thing," he said quietly, the admission not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by everyone. It was not a failure, but a shift, and the room felt it immediately. Amanda shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction. No, she said, her voice calm but certain. You have been teaching what you were given. The distinction settled in, removing blame, replacing it with perspective, and Brad nodded once, understanding more in that moment than he had in years of repetition. The students stood differently now, not straighter, not more rigid, but more aware, their movements quieter, their attention deeper, as if something inside them had recalibrated without instruction. Amanda took a step back from the center of the mat, not retreating, but releasing the space, allowing it to return to them. And for the first time since she entered, the room did not feel divided by levels or ranks. It felt unified by something shared, something simple, something real. She adjusted her sleeve again, the same small, deliberate motion from before, and began to turn toward the edge of the mat, her presence already beginning to shift away from the center. No one stopped her. No one called out. Because somehow, without asking, without demanding, she had already given them more than they expected. And as she walked slowly toward the door, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of something that would stay long after she was gone. And in that quiet moment, every person in that dojo knew that nothing about that day would be the same again. The door did not slam when Amanda left. It closed softly, almost unnoticed, yet the sound lingered longer than anything else that had happened that day, because it marked the end of something none of them had expected and the beginning of something none of them could ignore. The dojo remained still, no one rushing back to drills, no one eager to fill the silence with movement, as if the room itself needed time to absorb what had just taken place. Brad stood at the center for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the space where Amanda had been, not searching for her, but understanding what her absence now meant. For years, he had believed that mastery was something you displayed, something you proved, something you defended, but what he had just witnessed had none of those qualities, and yet it carried more weight than anything he had ever taught. He turned slowly, facing his students, and for the first time, there was no script behind his words, no structure to lean on. "We start over," he said, his voice steady, but changed, not louder, not softer, just honest. The statement caught them off guard, not because of what it meant, but because of how simply it was said. Eric lowered his gaze briefly, nodding once, not in submission, but in agreement, as if he too understood that what they had been practicing was only part of something much larger. The younger student near the back stepped forward again, this time with intention, her posture no longer shaped by imitation, but by awareness, and others followed, not in formation, but in quiet alignment. Brad watched them, not as an instructor measuring performance, but as someone seeing potential in a different way, and when he spoke again, his words carried a new kind of clarity. "Do not rush to move," he said. "Pay attention before the moment begins." The instruction was simple, but it held a meaning none of them would have recognized before that day. The room shifted again, not outwardly, but internally, as each student adjusted, not their stance, but their focus, their breathing slowing, their movements becoming less about execution and more about presence. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened, stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and for a brief moment, everything felt still in a way that was not empty, but full. Brad stepped back, giving them space, something he had rarely done, and in that space, the class began again, not as repetition, but as discovery. No one spoke Amanda's name, but she was there in everything, in the pauses, in the stillness, in the awareness that now shaped every movement. And somewhere beyond the walls of the dojo, Amanda Carter walked down the quiet street, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Because for her, it had not. It had simply been a moment where truth met attention, where something long practiced met something ready to see it. She did not look back, did not wonder what they thought, because she already knew that what mattered had already been understood. And back inside that room, as the students moved with a new kind of awareness, and as Brad stood watching without needing to control, one thing became clear without being spoken. That respect does not come from what you show the world, but from what you carry quietly within it. And on that day, in that quiet space, they finally understood what that meant.